Hello, everyone. My name is Raquel Batista, and welcome to Critica.NYC. It's a show focusing on the lives and work and politics of Latinos and Latinas in New York City and beyond. I am your host, Raquel Batista, and during this show, we will be talking about the global pandemic and the recent 2020 uprisings and how it's been impacting each of our guests today. We will be having bi-weekly chats with various thought leaders. Today, we're joined with 3 Dominican thought leaders who will be talking about their particular work and how they've been managing throughout the pandemic and their activities around the 2020 uprisings. I'd like to first introduce, and before I introduce each of our guests, I also wanted to mention that this show is dedicated to my friend and mentor, Angelo Falcon, who passed away 2 years ago. His work was connected and dedicated really towards documenting and advocating on behalf of Latinos. He was the founder and president of the National Latino Institute, and which was formerly named the Institute for Puerto Rican Policy. So I just wanted to take a moment to give that memory for Angelo Falcon. So today we have Led Black of the Uptown Collective. We have Dr. Griselda Rodríguez Solomon and Dr. Miguelina Rodríguez, who together are the Brujas of Brooklyn. And also we have Loira Limbal, who is a DJ, filmmaker, and the Senior Vice President of Firelight Media, and also the director and producer of her recent documentary, Through the Night. Thank you, everyone, for joining today.
Thank you for having us.
Yes.
Wonderful. So first, I wanted to just highlight, as we start talking about the global pandemic and the coronavirus, that it has had a specific impact on the Latino community, especially in New York City, where we have seen the greatest amounts of deaths in the Latino community. And also, coupled with this, all the recent activities that have been happening in the streets around the 2020 uprisings and the killing of George Floyd by a police officer, and all the work that's been happening. So I'd like to start off with Led Black, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself, about the work that Uptown Collective has done over the years, and what you've been doing, over the last several months, and in particular, if you can discuss a bit about what happened on Dyckman and the famous video that was on Twitter and hashtag Dominicans, where it brought a lot of attention on the issue in the Dominican community.
Yeah, so I run Uptown Collective, which is a hyper-local blog dedicated to Uptown, so Watts Heights, Inwood, Harlem. We've been around now for over 10 years, and it's just kind of about documenting all the stuff that's happening uptown, the way it's changing, and also what's come before, right? So it's like, I think we have a long view of Uptown. I grew up in Washington Heights. I like to say that I'm not just from Washington Heights, I'm of Washington Heights, right? Like, my parents, came from DR, and they moved to 183rd, and the only place I lived really, I lived in DR and I lived in Washington Heights. I lived other places, but Washington Heights is definitely my home. As far as the incident, I woke up Wednesday morning like everybody, or Tuesday night when they saw that, I was aghast, right? Because to see Dominicans trending And to see it for that reason was really unfortunate, right? Because that Dyckman incident wasn't what it was mischaracterized, right? So I was on Dyckman that night. I got there after the incident, right? So I didn't even know the incident happened. And then that morning, my wife showed me like the video. And to be honest, the video, they said the N-word, right? But that's how people uptown talk, right? So it's like that wasn't in itself any indication of racism. And what people don't really realize is like those kids were run off and chased, not because they were Black, it was because they were not familiar from there, right? Like they weren't from that immediate area. So like, for example, I grew up on 192nd in Wadsworth. I grew up right up the hill from Dyckman, but I didn't go to Dyckman as a kid, right? Because if I went to Dyckman, that would have happened to me. And we were all Dominican, right? It was just, they don't know me. What are you doing here? Same thing if I would have gone past 179th. I didn't go past 179th for that reason, right? And what people don't realize is like Dyckman, that happened on Dyckman and Post. Dyckman and Nagel, which is a block away, is Dyckman Projects. Dyckman Project has historically been Black, right? So there's plenty of Black people on Dyckman. They didn't get chased because they were Black. They got chased because they weren't known. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, right, came out of Dyckman houses, right? To kind of give you a long view of Dyckman and what it means, right? So I think that one of the things that I love about La Brujas, right, which I really shout them out so hard for, because they're academics, but they didn't play that game. And I was kind of bothered, to be honest, by how a lot of Dominicans took it and ran with it, right? So I think that Dominicans added, a lot of the educated academic Dominicans added to the maelstrom because they said, oh, I like Black people, maybe they don't. And it became something that it wasn't, and it conflated a bunch of different issues into one. So they conflated the issue of Dominican Republic and Haiti and anti-Black issues within Dominicans, right? But that wasn't what that was about. And I think we do need to have those conversations, but we need to be honest about what happened that night. And what happened that night wasn't a racial incident. And those same boys that were chased that night were back within 24 hours on the block showing love, showing that it wasn't a Black and Dominican thing, right? So, and I think we can't lose sight of that. We cannot allow us to be divided, right? New York City is a Black and brown city. And the moment we let anybody come in between us is the moment we lose. So I think we need to stay united, and unity is the only way forward.
Thank you for that, Led. And then that leads us to the Brujas of Brooklyn. And I also watched their famous, now I think it's like viral, it's gone everywhere, Instagram that lasted about 3 hours, where they were talking specifically about Dominicans, the issues of anti-Blackness and Black identity within our communities, both, and I think specifically here in the United States. So I definitely want to turn it over to them now so that you guys can, introduce yourselves, tell us a little bit about both your academic work and your work with Brujas of Brooklyn.
Thank you, Raquel. Thank you again. So my name is Griselda, and this is my twin sister, for those that don't know, Miguelina, and we're the Brujas of Brooklyn. I think that the conversation that we hosted last week, which was entitled Anti-Blackness and Dominicans, I think it garnered so much attention, not just because of the Dyckman incident, but I think because this is a conversation that has been, I don't want to say long overdue because it's been happening. But I think in the context of, like, let's say Black Lives Matter, I think it was an important conversation to have because, I'm gonna be honest, I watched, Miguelina was the one that informed me of the video and that Dominicans are trending. And before I knew any of the details, I just heard like Dominicans are trending for being anti-Black, and I didn't have details. And for me, I reacted instinctively, and I wasn't surprised because sadly, it wasn't surprised with that narrative that was floating around, which has now been revealed to be false, that this was like Dominican dudes on the block, like being anti-Black. I wasn't surprised that that was the narrative that was being created because of the history of Blackness and anti-Blackness among Dominicans. But Miguelina and I, we both hold PhDs in the social sciences with an emphasis on Dominican studies, Dominican identity. And we definitely wanted to create a new narrative around Dominican Blackness that was affirmative. Like to say there are Dominicans that acknowledge our Blackness, that embrace it, and that Dominican Republic and Dominican culture in the diaspora is a culture that is very much rooted in an African reality, that we've been conditioned to deny it and forget about it. It's something that has to be said and acknowledged. But I'm interested in shifting the narrative to talk about how we can come together as a community, as communities of color, as Black people across the diaspora, to make this movement stronger, because I'm personally tired of hearing and seeing Dominicans being bashed for being Black, for being anti-Black. And then, you know, that's a Freudian slip, right?
But then we're also bashed for identifying as Black, which is something I wanted to discuss. I watched the video almost live as it was posted. I got on Twitter and then I started following, and I barely slept that night. That was last Tuesday, because on both sides, there were such uninformed comments being made. And I think that as a Dominican woman who is very comfortable with her Blackness, who was born and raised in New York City, who has a very special relationship with Dyckman and the Heights. My research was on Dyckman and the Heights. We have family in the Heights, right? But then my experiences as an academic just took me to a place where I was like, why is this happening? You know, people have, they become Dominicanologists and Blackologists with their, you know, their degrees from Twitter University. And that's getting old. And this new paradigm after doing these uprisings, that has to shift, where people that like are informed need to start speaking up more. Because that's another thing, people who aren't that informed also go on Instagram and Facebook and they start talking things that are baseless. And I say baseless because they don't have proper historical context, right? For me, one of the messages that I kept repeating on that live is, we're not about to cancel Dominicans, right? We're not canceling nobody. Nobody's canceling Dominicans, because that doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore. And there's a lot of us that love being Black, that embrace our Blackness. But then what I'm starting to see now is like Afro-Latino people calling out lighter skinned Afro-Latinos and Latinas and like policing our Blackness. And I'm like, are y'all serious? So we're starting to mend this divide and continue to mend the divide between different Black groups across the diaspora. But now within the Afro-Latinx community, now people want to be gatekeepers of the identity. And I understand that as lighter skinned women with specific hair textures, we don't have the lived experience of, say, a very dark skinned Black man. That's why we invited Claudio into the second hour of our chat. We're very clear on that, and we make our position known, but that doesn't mean that we don't have our own lived experiences and we haven't encountered our own micro and very real aggressions within our families, within dating, within the academic circle. So I think that the conversation now needs to expand to one where we become more loving with each other as Afro-Latinos. And like, yes, take into account that our darker skinned sisters and brothers have a lived experience that some of us lighter skinned may not have. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't give me a right to be Afro-Latina. That's like someone like Beyonce or Tracee Ellis Ross, right? On the lighter hue, you know, Jesse Williams of the African-American, you know, spectrum, kind of telling them like, you're not really African-American. And I know it happens, but it sounds a little bit more ridiculous when you put it into that context. And I hope that that's where the conversation goes. There's one of the reasons why Griselda and I think we got so much like traffic in that video is because we brought a lot of love. From the very beginning, we were like, this is a space of a high vibration. We're not gonna shit on Dominicans, but we're also not gonna pretend like as a collective, we don't have an issue with anti-Blackness. And that's, I always wanna lead with love. And you could be loving and be fiery. You could be loving and keep it real, but love has to remain centered in the conversation.
Absolutely agreed. I mean, I think, you know, throughout my own career and my lifetime, I've been having these ongoing conversations around the issue of Black identity. You know, I went through it when I decided to no longer straighten my hair, and my mom owns a hair salon. And that was, to say the least, a very, very difficult situation. But that happened for me 20 years ago. And I think that definitely our community has come a long way even to this point. It still has a long way more to go. But I think that as, you know, we have more and more generations of US Dominicans here who have an increased level of consciousness around Blackness, that has really helped, I think, open up the conversation. So that, you know, brings me to Loira Limbal. I've known for, I think, over 20 years already. We first met through a youth movement that occurred in the Dominican community, Dominicans 2000, out of which a lot of Dominican leaders at this point came out of. People like, for example, Councilmember Miguelina Rodríguez, who was one of the heads of that movement, and several other people. Loira at that time, I think, had just released her first documentary, Estilo Hip Hop, and has committed her life to filmmaking. So I'm gonna turn it over now to Loira.
I'm muted. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all, old friends and new friends. I think, what I can say, I would underscore a lot of what's been said already, but to be additive, want to share a little bit of my personal experience with Dominicans, and even, you raising Dominicans 2000. That actually was a space that I was a part of and left because I didn't feel like the space was responsive or relevant to me. And that has been my experience in a lot of Dominican spaces, throughout my time. And the difficulty has been reconciling the love, respect, and admiration that I have for the very Black Dominican women who have raised me and who hold all of us down, and my discomfort, with our kind of collective culture as Dominicans, whether here in New York or in the DR. I also say I grew up between Harlem and the Bronx. I'm not a Washington Heights Dominican, and I actually think that there are nuances and key things in our experiences in terms of like how we identify or don't identify that are based on like boroughs and neighborhoods, and unfortunately the conversation, this country does not do nuance and complexity well around anything, but certainly not around immigrant communities, certainly not around race. And so these kind of nuances, we don't ever have a chance to talk about them and to like really, get into it. And my experience as a light-skinned person, kind of picking up on what the Brujas just touched on, is that I am light-skinned, but I have been consistently read as Black. I don't read as Latina to anyone. Dominicans are surprised that I'm Dominican. When I bust out of my Dominican Spanish, African Americans are like, oh, you Latina, I just thought you was Black. I have been racially profiled. I have had police pull out guns to my head. I have had white women, put their full hands in my hair because I'm such a curiosity and an oddity. So I've been harmed because I live in a body that is read as Black in multiple countries on multiple continents. The first time that I was called a nigger, I was 9 years old. It was in Midtown Manhattan. It was like a grown adult Orthodox Jewish man who accidentally bumped into me, was upset that I had, kind of interrupted his flow, turned around and yelled nigger at me, a child that was alone at that point, and nearly, spit on me. So for me, my experience has been one of like very, very early on, not having had like the luxury or the chance to be like, I'm anything other than Black, because there's been kind of clear violence and harm. And I would also say, my mother, I grew up with my mother and my great aunt, and they left the DR and moved to Puerto Rico. I was born in Puerto Rico, so I'm part of that like Domi Bori situation, which, is again, another layer of nuance, the movement between islands, not just when we leave our islands to come to the US or to Europe or wherever, and the ways that that impacts, our identity. And so in the case of my mother and my great aunt, they obviously experienced all of the colorism that is rampant in the Dominican Republic, grew up with that hyper color, racial phenotype consciousness that we have as Dominicans, which, when I lived in Brazil, I heard a sister say one time, she kind of likened all of the racial and phenotype and color categories that Brazilians have to the way that Eskimos have over 150 names for ice, because depending on the nuances of that ice, that determines your like likelihood of survival, right? And what your possibilities will be any given season. And that's true for us in a Latin American context. We are mad specific about what kind of whatever combination you are. We have so many names. And it's not something that we just do because we are naturally, psychotic. It is a result of colonialism and slavery and white supremacy and this virus, which is truly a virus, kind of thinking about the pandemic and all of that and what we consider diseases or not, that we're all infected with, but to say that my mother and my great aunt experienced all of the things that they experienced in the DR. They moved to Puerto Rico, and before coming to New York, already had a consciousness around themselves as being Black racialized others, because that's the space that Dominicans occupy in Puerto Rico today. Dominicans in Puerto Rico are much more likely to identify as Black than your average Dominican in New York. So much so that there's a little bit of kind of tension among Dominicans and Afro-Boricuas, because the assumption in Puerto Rico is that if you're Black, you're Dominican, which sometimes erases Afro-Boricuas. And they're like, yo, but like we here too, you know what I mean? Like, so, they, by the time that they got to New York, they had also had, their racialized experiences. So that's like the household that I grew up in, which again are these things where even when we're talking about, light skin privilege, which is real, and like the reality of colorism in our communities, there's still like, 8 more layers to dig under there in order to have conversations that will move us forward. And for me, I am interested in the conversations that are going to move us forward, the difficult conversations, the uncomfortable conversations. I'm interested in accountability, truth, transparency. It ain't about anybody being comfortable and being let off the hook, but like, I love my people. And Black people speak Spanish, they speak English, they speak Portuguese, they speak Dutch, they, on and on and on, right? And so I'm trying to see us get free. And that's, that is why I do what I do and why I work in film and in music as a DJ, because, I have a homie that says, Jeff Chang, who's an author and a scholar, who says that politics is where some of the people are some of the time, and culture is where all of the people are all of the time. And so, I invest my time in creating that culture, right? Like those affirmative spaces where we can clearly state what we are and move away from defining ourselves by what we are not, which as Dominicans, I think is a huge part of our identity. Identity has been in many ways shaped by a rejection of Haiti, it's an identity that is based on a deficit, it's a rejection. And so I think our task, our generation, is to pick up the baton, that is being handed to us, because we have to recognize that this work has been done for generations. We're not new, this is not the beginning, we're a continuation. But the work now is to create that culture that is affirmative about like, what is it to be a Black Dominican, and to really like lay that down,
Well, thank you so much, Loira, for that. So why don't you, Brujas, I want to go back to you a little bit, and can you tell us just a little bit more about the work that you both have been doing over the last several months once the global pandemic kind of like really took off here in New York? You guys really took to Instagram and started talking about the importance of grounding ourselves and the spiritual work that we needed to do. Can you tell us just a little bit more about that work that you've been doing?
Griselda and I have been holding a lot of spiritual space since the pandemic started, and we just saw that there was a need. There was a lot of misinformation and lack of information in terms of wellness, because, coming from different hoods, from different underrepresented, disadvantaged communities, a lot of our folks turn to like allopathic medicine for assistance, a very white-centered allopathic system, when we have like this medicine at the, you know, at our fingertips that our mothers and our grandmothers and grandfathers had. And we're trying to reclaim that a bit, because that's where our real healing comes from. Griselda's a doula, and she could speak a bit on that. So she's been dabbling with birth injustice for years, and the fact that women of color, Black and Latinx women specifically, die at higher rates during and after birth. And so when this whole news that people of color, Black and Latinx groups were disproportionately being affected and dying due to the complications of COVID, we weren't shocked, fortunately and unfortunately. Some people were like, oh my goodness, why? Griselda and I weren't shocked because we knew why. There were a lot of reasons why. And we just stepped up and we started holding space and just informing people like, this is elderberry that you can drink. We started sharing a recipe that's been in our family for generations, like red onions, apples, cinnamon, ginger, like a typical day that our grandmother and our mothers and our aunts used to make us, just things to help people feel like they're like putting a shield of sorts around themselves in terms of their immunity. But more importantly, we were holding spiritual space, understanding that this is spiritual warfare, right? What we're battling is not only a virus that's airborne, it's a virus that's racism, it's a virus that's sexism, it's a virus that has segregated us into specific disadvantaged communities, and really uplifting people's spirits, because that's what we felt was needed at the time, specifically people of color. So this is why in a beautiful way, our work just kind of melds and exists in this intersection that is just not about holding space for wellness and for folks of color, but understanding that our identities are very much tied to our wellness in many ways. So like, you know, Loira, you used a word that I think I use often, like I look at the condition in which a lot of Dominicans exist as a psychosis of sorts. And it's not just Dominicans, you know, Frantz Fanon wrote about this, you know, in his like book and work, Wretched of the Earth. It's just people that have been colonized. You have people across the continent of Africa, South Asians, you have Native Americans, just people who had brutal, violent contact with colonialism and then imperialism. We've been conditioned to exist in a state of psychosis so that we can feel disempowered and not be our full selves. So I think that leads to a sense of imbalance that then calls for wellness that's very much rooted in a decolonial context. Because it's not just about let's hold space to increase your immunity, to increase, you know, the strength of your aura, but it's like increase your strength of your aura because our lineages have been demoralized through colonialism, through different forms of systemic racism. And then in a more particular sense, spiritually, I always say that there's a huge part of Dominican identities that are not honored on this ancestral plane because we've been conditioned because of survival to not understand and embrace the aspects of us that are very much rooted to Africa and that are Black. So that also leads to a disconnect that leads to an imbalance that then leads to illness, right? Dis-ease. So the work that we do is very much about making sure that in our presence, people feel whole and well, because what we're doing is not new. You know, we're doing stuff that we've inherited on a cellular level, and we're just creating new age dynamics to make it more attractive, if you will, to people. But in reality, we're doing like intergenerational forms of healing from systems of enslavement and racism that have really left us scarred. One of the things I wanted to touch on is to focus on one of the more central aspects of our work. A lot of people met us last Tuesday. Like, our following has increased significantly, and people know us, oh, those two twins that talk about Blackness and DR. And I love that. I love that. That's our introduction to a lot of people. But our central work with the spiritual realm is on womb wellness. We call it woke womb work, because we have to help women who are, for the most part, the cradles of culture, the ones that pass culture down, to reconnect with that source of power that through patriarchy and then racism we've been disconnected from. Because a lot of people may not know that we are in our grandmother's womb, because when our grandmother is carrying our mother, when we're little babies in utero, we have all the eggs we will ever have, even into womanhood. And energetically, we are living in our mother's womb, who's in our grandmother. So epigenetics is a real thing. When your grandmother is experiencing some sort of trauma, she passes it down to your mother, and then she passes it down to you energetically. But then your mother is raised usually in the same system, in the same circles that created that trauma, and then she carries you. And we're helping women tap in because it's said, and we believe, that when a woman heals, a culture heals. And this is not like saying that men don't carry culture. It's just the way we've been socialized and conditioned. Women, we pass on culture and we pass on healing. So when you tap into that power, especially as women of color whose wombs were used to create slavery, right? Because that is where people multiplied and that's where slavery was kept, right? When your womb has been used as a form of capital, you have a lot of undoing and a lot of untraumatizing to do. So that's very central to our work. I just wanted to add that on because that's extremely important when we talk about a group of people that, I love the word that was used, our identity is formed on deficit, right? When your identity is like a negation of something, right? You have to reclaim that. And one of the many ways you can is by tapping into your womb power.
Beautiful. So, I think that's a great way for us to talk about children and, leading us to have a little bit of a conversation about Loira's film. She just directed and produced a lovely film, which I got to watch the trailer, called Throughout the Night, about a 24-hour daycare center in New Rochelle. Loira, can you tell us a little bit about that film? And then hopefully we can get it queued up so we can watch it a bit and then do a little bit of commentary on it.
Sure. But before I do, I want to say something else. I'm going to go a little bit rogue.
Okay.
Because I raised the issue of kind of my difficulty or discomfort, in Dominican spaces growing up. And I would say that part of what has allowed me to return, to my community and really sort of own it and take up space and say, like, y'all Dominicans that, are hell-bent on keeping us, where we've been, y'all are not the only Dominicans. And you're not the only ones that get to speak for us, that it is important for all of us to speak for us because Dominicans, as any other group, we're not a monolith, and that a multiplicity of voices are important and sort of feeling like I have a right to speak up as a Dominican, but part of what even like made me want to re-engage and want to return to that space was the experience of having lived in Brazil and then spending time in Cuba, spending time in Colombia with Afro-Colombian communities, Afro-Cubans, Afro-Brazilians, and seeing back to this word of psychosis, that the psychosis is very, very similar in countries throughout Latin America that have large Black populations, like large, significant, visibly Black populations. And I think that part of the issue with Dominicans in New York and why we everybody, I feel like everybody wants to pick on us, everybody wants to cancel us, is that there are no other Latino groups with a huge population in New York City that is visibly Black. We're the only ones. It's not a huge Afro-Brazilian community here, My ex-husband is Afro-Brazilian and he always used to complain about the fact that the Brazilians that are here are not Black, that he couldn't find his people here, There's not a huge Afro-Colombian community in New York City. Los colombianos que están aquí no son Afro-Colombianos, The Afro-Cubans that used to live here have moved. They've left New York City. When I was growing up in Harlem, we still had Afro-Cubans left in New York. That community has left the city. So we're kind of like the only ones. And so people think that this psychosis is unique to us, but it's truly not. It's really a hallmark of the way that the Spanish and the Portuguese did their dirty business. That's how they did their dirt. It's just a different brand. It's a different approach. The Dutch colonies is a whole other thing too. You know what I mean? So, I say that to say, I think that's part of the heat that we get, which is not to call out, Brazilians and Colombians or whatever, but just to say that we exist within a larger community of folks that have very similar behaviors and who manifest this virus of whiteness and white supremacy in very similar ways. But in New York City, we're kind of like the only ones, not to say that Boricuas are not Black, but overall, by and large, and also even when they're not Black, they're still racialized. So I also want to hold space for that, like, even if you're not in a Black body, if you're like Boricua in New York, that's a really specific thing and a very specific racialization and experience, even if you look like you're Italian, you know, or like from the Mediterranean. And so that's true too. But by and large, like, we're the only ones, you know, that have like a big presence here. And I think that's part of the you know, the issue of why we get kind of singled out. So I wanted to say that, and then
and along those lines, Loira, I mean, the fact that, you know, Dominicans are one of the largest Latino immigrant groups in New York State, and you know, we have been growing politically, maybe not necessarily at the rate that we should. And I always kind of take a step back when the Dominican community is being criticized, especially in a moment like this, when there's been a lot of unity around the issue of police brutality, right? Yeah. And so while we are, right, we're here, we're talking, and we're dealing with what's been going on internally in our community, it's also about us being consciente, right, of what's going on the outside and why someone would want to use that particular incident to kind of break up any sort of unity that may be occurring within our communities. And so, like, you know, I definitely want to get to your film, but I wanted to bring it to Led Black real quick, to just comment a little bit more about that. And also, you, through your work with Uptown Collective, you've been, you know, highlighting the work of photographers and filmmakers and artists in Washington Heights, and you yourself have documented a lot of what's happened over the years. And if you can talk about the fact that Dominicans also continue, right, we have suffered through a lot of what have been suffered by all poor Black communities in New York City, including police brutality and the killing of Kiko Garcia back in 1992. If you could just comment a bit about that.
Sure, and you know, and I want to also say, like, Loira was talking about, like, nuance, and I think there's a lot of nuance when it comes to Washington Heights itself, right? So what Washington Heights you experience depends what years you grew up in Washington Heights and where in the Heights you grew up in, right? So I grew up in 192nd, and 192nd, even though we were overwhelmingly Dominican, the next biggest group was American Black people, right? So I have pictures of the riots in 1992. I was 16 years old. I went out with my friends. The two other people you see in those pictures are African-American, right? These are my best friends growing up, and they were the people that I associated with when I was a child. So sometimes, you know, people think Dominican, yeah, there's mad Dominicans, but there's been Black people in Washington Heights for a long, long time, you know? And I think, you know, I first, it was a kid from Harlem. I was the only person, I went to 143 junior high school. I was the only person in my junior high school to make it to Bronx Science, right? So when I made it to Bronx Science, I didn't realize I was poor until I went to Bronx Science, right? Because up to that point, everyone was like me, you know, they was like broke. But I didn't realize what that meant until I went somewhere where people had money. You know what I'm saying? So I had culture shock, and it was a brother from Harlem, Ben Talton, who's an author now. He's a professor and author. He gave me the autobiography of Malcolm X, and it changed my life, and it made me look at history different. So I was like 14, 15 years old talking about Blackness, and I think I tried to sell my family on it, but they weren't understanding that. And I think it's sometimes, like, we really do need to speak to each other with love and consideration, and that we all come into this journey differently. And I remember as a child, right, you know, when I was all up, you know, just really young Black, I was all about that when I was a child. And at 15 years old, fight night was a big deal in my house, right? So my dad's there with all his friends. They're watching the fight, they're drinking. And there's this dude who is so dark, right, that his nickname is Rubio, right? This dude is like 6'2", 6'3", full of muscles. He looked like a linebacker for the Giants, you know, when the Giants were the Giants, right? But again, they call him Rubio, right? So we're watching the fight, and there's a Black African-American man on the you know, one of the boxes, and he keeps going, mira ese prieto, mira ese prieto, mira ese prieto. Mind you, the dude that's on fighting is like several shades lighter than him. Several shades. I mean, like way lighter. So I said, mi hermano, usted es prieto. And then he goes to me, and I never forgot it, and I've been trying to work this into a piece. He goes, no. Yo no soy prieto. Yo soy blanco oscuro. Motherfucker, he said, I'm dark-skinned white, right? Like, I mean, that just goes to show you. And I also think that that was indicative, right? That it's not so much that he hates black people, he hates himself, right? He's a black man for all intents and purposes, but he's saying, he coming up with some absurdity like Blanco Scooter, right? So I think that is real easy to scapegoat Dominicans, right? It's real easy to say Sammy Sosa, but we're not the only ones that do skin lightening, right? That's big all across the diaspora, right? So I think that while it's easy to scapegoat, it doesn't really get us anywhere, right? And we do need to have those conversations, but we need to have a conversation as I grew up on Malcolm. I grew up on Garvey, right? I'm a Garveyite. I'm a Pan-Africanist, right? So I'm black irrespective of shade, right? And I'm African irrespective of nationality. And I think one of the things the Brujas talked about on the IGTV segment, that which I thought was really powerful, was the idea of blackness, right? That we are all black. Not only that, the Dominicans, in a sense, we were the first blacks, right? Because it was on our island where you first had, slavery in the plantation. That we were first, in a sense. 1619 was 100 years after we were already coming to this side of the world, right? So I think we need to also what I would like to say is no one's blacker than me, right? You're not blacker than me because you're American black and you're dark. You're not blacker than me. We are all as black as we're all gonna be. And I think we need to all accept that, right? And that blackness is a road. We're all on that same road, and there's differences and there's nuances, but I don't think that there should be a hierarchy, right? Where someone's blacker than, no, I'm as black as anybody else. And I think we need to get there, but we got to get there through love and through caring for one another and generosity of spirit.
Thank you, Led. And I'm glad that you mentioned. Go ahead.
Can I say something, Raquel, to the dark-skinned white comment? When I was living in Brazil, I had somebody tell me that I was a white person that didn't work out. And then they specified that I didn't work out because my hair and my nose and my lips, but that I was, So again, back to this thing of like, this is not just Dominicans, and that we have, the way I look at it, and I'm not here to tell anyone how to move and what to do, but the way that I look at it is like, this is a disease that affects all of us in different ways. And that this affects us precisely because we're black. And so we cannot afford to cancel each other. Like someone said, I forget who said it, they're like, the only people that worry about good hair and bad hair are black people. Like white people are not having that conversation. So the fact that we have it so much, is a testament to our blackness, right? And so, just wanted to say that because I was like that dark-skinned white person reminded me. It took me back to that moment in Brazil.
Yeah. And, and I wanted to mention, Led, you said First Blacks, the Dominican Study Institute does have a whole project called First Blacks, and they have a website, firstblacks.org, I think it is. And we can definitely post that information on that, where it talks about the enslavement of Black people in the Dominican Republic and the history of Blackness in the Dominican Republic, where they look at, old Spanish documents and all sorts of things. So, even in the intellectual spaces, Dominican academics have been grappling and working on this issue for years, and producing actual things that we can all take a look at. And then I think it's about how do we trickle down those conversations into the mainstream so that all of our families really start engaging in this healing. So why don't we take a moment right now to take a look at Loira's film, Throughout the Night. And then we can, through the night, I'm sorry, Loira. And then we can have a little bit of a conversation on it in the last few minutes of our time together.
I've been doing this for 22 years. These mothers and fathers, they have 3 and 4 jobs to take care of their children. That's why I do what I do, because they deserve it. Good morning, Pop. Talk to me, you big boy.
It's not their fault that I work the way that I work, so I just do what I can. It's not easy, but you know, eventually I'll sleep.
What are you looking for?
I'm looking for a full-time job. All 3 jobs that I have right now combined into one.
Beautiful. That was really wonderful, Loira. I think, you know, it's interesting that we bring this up as we're talking about issues of identity and, you know, the pandemic and the uprisings. I mean, at the end of the day, we just all want to create a better future and a better world for our children, right? All of us here, I believe we're all parents. And, you know, we even before... Oh, okay, not yet, but you're a tia. So being a tia is like being a parent too, because you're there for a talent. Yes. So, you know, I think that, but we're all right committed to creating that better world. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to making this film and just even the timeliness of your film was supposed to be released right around the time all of this started happening and New York shut down and the outside shut down, you know, and thinking about the future, right, of what is it, what does all of this mean as we move forward?
Yeah, so the film Through the Night was supposed to premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival in late April. And, you know, I decided to make the film because I was raised by a single mom who worked as a home health aide and worked the night shift, raising us. And I'm the oldest of 4, so I was my mother's right hand. And I remember precisely how hard it was for her, you know, and to think like 30, 40 years later, the kind of the paradigm, the framework has not changed. You know, when I think about like kind of trying to connect the dots in this conversation about, you know, my work as an artist and what I'm focused on in terms of creating those spaces of affirming like what is our truth and what is our reality as a counterpoint to the narrative that has been like forced upon us. For me, it was really about creating a portrait of the interdependence and the solidarity that I have seen firsthand, you know, among poor, working class, Black and Latina women, whether the Latinas are Black Latinas or not, you know, that has been my experience in Harlem and the Bronx. It has been, you know, you lose your childcare last minute and you don't work a job where you could just call out sick y tú le tienes que decir a la vecina, agárrame los muchachos un rato, you know, whoever that vecina is. You know, and in my case, growing up in my community, those vecinas were sometimes Dominican, sometimes they were African American, sometimes they were Jamaican, sometimes they were Ecuadorian, you know, and people hold each other down, which again, like thinking about this specific New York City conversation that we're having today, that is also the reality, you know, in our communities, that while there are many ways in which we reproduce whiteness and harm each other, there are also many ways in which we hold each other down and stand in solidarity with each other along class lines, you know, which I think is a really important conversation for us to have, because oftentimes we separate racial justice from conversations about class and economics, you know, and the two go hand in hand, obviously, you know, white supremacy and capitalism, they're like Batman and Robin, you know, and wanting to create a portrait of that, like of what is true to our experiences. And again, in this idea of like affirming the things that we are doing right. We're not just our problems, we're not just what oppresses us, like we're more than that, you know, and we have to create depictions of that in our popular culture, you know, like with my work as a DJ, I honestly, personally feel like every time I can blend seamlessly from Angolan kuduro to Dominican dembow to Nigerian Afrobeat and end up on James Brown somehow, I feel like I am reconnecting parts of us that have been severed, you know? And I think that is how I approach the work of film and music and art and culture. It is a space to create the things that we want to see, you know, and to represent ourselves and our complexity and our totality, you know, as human beings. So the film was born from that, you know, from very personal, but also kind of like political and heart aspirations, if you will.
And if I may, I want to kind of piggyback on what she said, that one of the things I think got lost with the Dyckman incident, right, is that, like I said, I didn't go to Dyckman, I didn't go past from 79th, but the people on Dyckman, for a long time, they never got along either, even though they were Dominican, right? So you have upper post and lower post, and they never got together. And the dudes on post didn't speak to the dudes on Sherman, and they had beef with the dudes on Vermilion. And what happened that night, and I think gets lost, is all over Washington Heights, people were organizing to not have their businesses looted. So the night before, you had looting in the Bronx and Burnside and Fordham. So I think people, like what got missed in the whole melee about Dominicans being racist was that Dominican young folks who had beef for, you know, generations now got together to not have their neighborhood looted. And I think that's super important, that, like, I think the reason that Washington Heights didn't go the way of the South Bronx back in the days was because Dominicans, we're really kind of like into that business, and we take care of business for one another. And at times we come together when we need to. So I think that's what was missed about the whole Dyckman incident, that people that have historical beef came together for one night, and then social media took away and ran with it. And I think we here are kind of putting our own thing on it by saying, nah, that's not what happened. So I just think that was important as well.
But I mean, even the incident on Dyckman was such a blessing. Like, Griselda and I have been using that word to discuss COVID and the pandemic. And sometimes people are like, what? How is this a blessing? I know the five of us could talk about so many things that have happened on the positive end, despite the loss and everything because of COVID. Similarly, like, the situation on Dyckman was such a blessing because I feel like it spurred something that just started. And I want to go back to what was said earlier. This isn't new. Us talking about Afro-Latinos and Blackness in the DR is nothing new, but something shifted because now we have a megaphone through social media. And I appreciate that something like this is happening where it's people who we know what we're talking about. And I'm being very honest, versus someone who's just speaking, let's say, only from a lived experience. And that's more important than worse when someone is only speaking from an academic context. We're actually here providing context and lived experience, which I think is only the beginning of something bigger. I want to believe.
Yeah, and I appreciate the conversation. And Loira, I watched another trailer to the film, but I didn't realize you were the filmmaker. Like maybe a month ago, and I told Miguel, like, you know, it brought me to tears just as a mother, you know, as daughters of another, you know, a Black Dominican immigrant woman who also raised us single, and the vecinas were like, no echaban el ojo, and, you know, the extended family, right? So thank you so much for that film. You know, I just get chills just thinking about it, right? And I think that this is where the narrative has to go, about looking at what we can provide and contribute to a conversation about coalitions, as opposed to where I was for a long time in my 20s, when I was unlearning a lot of the shit, where I was looking at the deficits. Oh, Dominicans are self-hating. Like you, Loira, I had to also draw a boundary between myself and Dominicanness at one point for many reasons, but specifically because my now husband and then boyfriend and fiance is African-American, dark-skinned African-American. And y'all can already imagine all the baggage that was unearthed in my family because
and quickly, unlike you, Loira, our family came from like a very white campo, and they were like one of the darker skinned people to Santiago, then to Brooklyn. So they didn't have that buffer that's Puerto Rico. They didn't have the buffer that is, let's say, La Capital, Santo Domingo. They went from two very white spaces in the Dominican Republic to Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. So my family still is like lo prieto, y eso prieto, and this is what Griselda is referring to.
You know, but I'm interested in contributing to conversations that enforce a positive narrative, that like we've been here and we are just a newer face to a movement that existed since like what, 1517 with the first uprisings of enslaved Africans in La Natividad. That's when our rebellion started. It started on the slave ships, on these dungeons, right? You know, and then I have indigenous ancestors. But the point is that like I feel emotionally depleted at having to constantly defend Dominicans, which I will do with tooth and nail, always in context and pulling our coattail and recognizing when we don't live up to our highest potential as Dominican people. But I'm more interested in bringing the conversation forward with what can we contribute in the context of Black Lives Matter, in the context of this uprising that is class-based, that is race-based, and looking at people like us, not negating that we have to also look at the deficits that exist in our cultures, but really focusing on the fact that we're here. We're here, like using younger folks' term, like we here, we woke, like,
and to be honest with you, the three of you are a bit older than we are. So even that, where it's like we are in our late 30s, and I know the three of you are a bit older, and you've been doing this work. And then you go deeper to the young lords. You go deeper. This isn't new, and we also want to be cautious not to act like the five of us, or I'll speak for both of us, like we just started this conversation on Afro-Dominicanness, because we also have to pave the way and give respect to those that came before us and paved the way and went through worse, because at least right now there's five of us and there's a lot more where we came from. Like I what you said resonated, Led, when you were like, you went to middle school and you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and then you went home like, we're black, and your family was not having it. I could imagine, like, at least I had her, at least we had other friends that were like, we're not the only one that feel that way. So it's very important to bring that conversation and that context so that we don't act like we're self-made, like a lot of these younger generation folks, self-made. And no, we are here speaking because people sacrificed themselves and their families and their friendships over this cause.
There has been always a history of Dominicans working in collaboration with many communities in New York City, with the Puerto Rican community, with the African-American community, on a variety of issues, from housing to voting rights to, economic development, so for me, I thought it was really important, for us to take this moment to do this reflection, to have this conversation, and to, so that people know, like how you said, Miguelina, that we're here and we're not going anywhere. So I want to thank all of you. And I want to thank the Manhattan Neighborhood Network for giving us this platform. I want to thank our executive producer, Zenaida Mendez, for this opportunity. And hopefully we'll get to continue this conversation again. So thank you very much.